Well, hello, everyone. I'm Todd Green. I'm the Executive Director of WorkRise. We're a research to action network hosted by the Urban Institute. Welcome to day two of our conference, our afternoon of Charting a Resilient Future for U.S. Workers, Solutions to Navigate an Uncertain Economy. And it's co-hosted by WorkRise and our list of great partners. So for those of you who weren't able to be with us yesterday, welcome back. And for those of you who are joining for the first time, we want to extend a warm welcome to you. So thank you for taking the time to be with us. And before we get started today, I want to share a few housekeeping reminders. Our event is being recorded, and the recording will be posted online afterwards, of course. All of our speaker biographies are available online. And we've enabled closed captions for accessibility, so you can hide your captions or adjust settings with the live transcript button. All participants are muted, but you can type your questions or comments into the Q&A box at any time. And please take 1 or 2 minutes to complete the survey at the end of the event. And then lastly, engage with us online at using hashtag #ResilientFuturesLive. So yesterday we heard from a cross-section of leaders in government and advocacy and research on strategies to support workers as they navigate the unique labor market we are in, one where job and wage growth has been strong, but where inflation has made it difficult for families to pay their bills and save for the future. So we heard about innovative solutions from the highest levels of government to grassroots leaders who are engaging local communities to affect change. Now, today we're going to pivot to the critical role of employers in shaping worker outcomes. Employers and their policies and practices exert enormous influence over workers' day-to-day economic realities, as well as their long-term prospects. In fact, according to the American Opportunity Index, a scorecard that ranks companies on how well their employees can move up the corporate ladder, picking the right company to work for is likely the most important decision a worker, particularly a young worker, can make. So today we'll hear from business leaders themselves on innovative strategies and programs their companies have established to build inclusive systems and ladders of opportunity for those who face structural barriers and exclusion. We'll hear directly from employers on how they're thinking about inclusive hiring and talent management practices, in ways they're taking a whole person approach to their workforce by supporting workers through economic security and mobility programs. We'll also take a deep dive into the research on employer practices that have the potential to be replicated and scale. Now, as many of you know, WorkRise is also a funder of research. And through our grant making, we're committed to investing in knowledge building on innovative practices to support workers' economic mobility. And today we have an exciting announcement on this front. So I am very proud to announce our next slate of grantees, 9 innovative pilot studies aimed at improving economic security, mobility for low-wage workers. These winning projects will generate new evidence to inform policy and practice by rigorously testing real-world innovations. These interventions are aimed at improving workers' digital skills, providing social and economic supports to workers and small businesses, and making talent pools more inclusive through skills-based hiring. Now, I encourage you to read more about the winning project teams on our announcement, which we'll share with you now and also through the chat. So now, without further ado, I'd also like to introduce our opening speaker, Maria Flynn. So many of you here, Maria Flynn needs no introduction. As president and CEO of Jobs for the Future, Maria has been a change agent for inclusive and equitable workforce and economic development policies and programs over the course of her 3 decades-long career. Maria has been a pioneer in forging connections between traditional workforce and education systems and technology-driven solutions to the challenges facing workers, employers, and educators. She's a national authority on the future of work, the role of technology in the labor market, employer engagement, and career pathways for workers and learners, underserved by traditional workforce and education systems. So it's my pleasure to welcome Maria to the Zoom.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Todd, for that terrific introduction. You're too kind. It is just terrific to be partnering with you on this event, and I know I'm really looking forward to the conversations that we're going to hear this afternoon. JFF is really proud to be a co-host along with WorkRise for this conversation, and as Todd mentioned, we have a number of other terrific partners from across the country, and I'll just list them really quickly so everyone knows. But our other partners are AARP, the Business Roundtable, the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, the Family and Workers Fund, and the Rework America Alliance, which is an initiative of the Markle Foundation. And I think that one of the best things about working in the workforce space is that we get to collaborate with such wonderful colleagues who are all sharing really the same mission and vision, I think, that we all do, which is a society in which equitable economic advancement is attainable for all. So it's wonderful to be coming together to convene this event. And as Todd said, today's theme is really focused on employers. And as he also mentioned, I've been working kind of in this space for over 30 years, which is a little hard to believe, but I truly feel that we are at a very unique moment in time. I think historically, obviously, employers have been part of the workforce development conversation, but I feel that now more than ever, we are truly feeling moments and wonderful examples of employer leadership and investment in ways that we really haven't seen before. And the American Opportunity Index that Todd mentioned is something that really highlights some of those wonderful practices that we're seeing. And if you haven't taken a look at that, I encourage you to do so. It's a collaboration between Burning Glass Institute, Joe Fuller at Harvard Business School, and the Schultz Family Foundation. And the Wall Street Journal had a great extended coverage of it in this past weekend's Weekend Journal, if you haven't seen that. And I think that, we've seen this trend growing, but I think we can probably all agree that it was the events that we all experienced 2 years ago in 2020, when our lives were turned upside down by the global pandemic. And we as a US society were really beginning to reckon with the deep and systemic racism and inequality that's embedded across all of our systems and institutions. And I think since then, we've really seen workers demand more from their workplaces, and we have seen workers really gain more power in the labor market than they have in some time. So really interesting to see what has happened over these past couple of years. And in our first panel, that's going to be facilitated by my good friend Dane from the Business Roundtable, we're going to hear from employers themselves who are going to talk about the steps that they have taken to really put employees and workers at the heart of their policies and their practices. At JFF, we have a framework called the Impact Employer Framework that outlines what we feel those practices should include. And I'm happy to put a link to that later in the chat so folks can take a look at that. We're also going to hear from a panel of researchers and practitioners to really better understand the evidence base and what it's saying about the promising ideas and solutions that can support worker advancement in today's labor market. And I am super excited about our final presentation, which is going to feature Dr. Aisha Francis. Dr. Francis is the president of Benjamin Franklin Cummings Institute of Technology, which is an institution here in Boston where I am based. And she's going to talk about ways that her institution supports the career aspirations of workers and learners. And she's going to be joined by one of their alumni, Deshawn Brandel, in that conversation. I've had the great opportunity to talk with Dr. Francis a couple times in the past few months, and I am so inspired by her work and her leadership, and I know that you will be too. Just to underscore what Todd suggested, we really encourage you to input comments and questions in the chat box here on the Zoom platform, and also to amplify what you hear on social media with the hashtag #ResilientFuturesLive. One final item I want to flag is that my former colleagues at the U.S. Department of Labor, where I worked for many years, their Office of Evaluation is celebrating their 10th anniversary of their inception, and they're going to be having a series of webinars over the next couple of weeks that really digs into the research and evaluation resources that you can find in their center. And so I will also put a link to the registration for those events in the chat. I think it's really relevant to the conversation that we're having here today. So thank you again for having me and for having JFF as part of this event and this wonderful partnership. And Todd, I will turn it back to you to introduce our first panel.
Oh, thank you so much, Maria, for those incredible remarks and for the partnership. So I'm delighted to introduce our moderator, Dane Lynn. And Dane is the Vice President of Corporate Initiatives at the Business Roundtable, and he's also a member of the WorkRise Leadership Board. He leads the Business Roundtable's efforts to engage member companies on making collective progress and apply best practices on issues such as worker training, diversity, investments in rural communities, veteran and second chance employment, and engagement with small business suppliers. And a note to the audience, this segment was previously recorded, but we still encourage you to share your comments and questions in the audience Q&A box. So turning it over to Dane.
Welcome to our signature panel for the second day of WorkRise and Partners Conference, Charting a Resilient Future for U.S. Workers, Solutions to Navigate an Uncertain Economy. We're proud at the Business Roundtable to be co-hosting this conference with WorkRise and other partners, including the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, Jobs for the Future, AARP, the Families and Workers Fund, and Rework America Alliance, a Markle Foundation initiative. I'm honored and delighted to moderate today's signature panel, which brings together 5 esteemed leaders from companies that are tackling the issue of what employers can do to build both economic security and economic mobility for their workforce. As we know from historical trends, workers, particularly those in frontline positions and those in low and middle wage jobs, have fallen further behind and now are less likely than their parents' generation to enter and remain in the middle class. And of course, these historical trends have exacerbated longstanding racial inequities with Black and Latino workers. Indeed, this question of how private employers in America can create pathways for economic advancement has been a priority within my own organization, the Business Roundtable, and our member companies. Many BRT member companies are pursuing equity-driven initiatives, such as skills-based hiring and advancement policies. Over the past years, we have secured commitments of nearly 80 of our member companies as part of the Multiple Pathways Initiative to commit to specific actions aimed at skills-based hiring systems that are inclusive and allow individuals to not only enter the corporate community, but also allow them to advance in those companies. Our companies have also invested significant resources in employee training, reskilling, and upskilling. The Multiple Pathways Initiative is driven by a core set of principles, which at their heart advance 3 central ideas. 1, skills are as important as degrees in signaling to employers a job applicant's ability to do the job. 2nd, employers are playing a central role in the reskilling and upskilling and the continuous learning that are vital for employees to not only obtain the skills, but to succeed in the workplace. And lastly, hiring practices should expand opportunities for people from a wide range of backgrounds and experiences. One's success in corporate America should not depend on whether or not they've obtained a credential and where they obtained that credential. I'm delighted this afternoon to be joined by an incredible group of speakers today who can share some examples of the innovative steps their companies are taking to be more equitable and inclusive in their hiring and retention practices, and to create a platform for economic mobility for their workforce. Speakers, as I introduce you, please go on camera. Julie Kaufman is the Chief Diversity Officer and Global Head of the DEI practice at Bain & Company, a global consulting firm. Wanda Hope is the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at Johnson & Johnson, the world's largest and most broadly based healthcare company in the country. Heather Jacobs is Senior Vice President, Chief Human Resources Officer at Delaware North, a global leader in hospitality and food management based in upstate New York. And last but not least, Franz Pasha is the Senior Vice President of Chief Corporate Affairs Officer at PayPal, a multinational financial technology company. So with that, panelists, let's jump right in. No opening remarks this afternoon. We're going to jump right into some of the questions. And I really want to focus the beginning of our conversation around the economy. You know, during the first day of the conference, we heard a lot about inflation, the cost of living for American families and individuals, just the broad economic context that individuals in this country are struggling with. The inflation we're experiencing has been particularly challenging for individuals, workers in low-wage jobs and their families. But at the same time, there's been plenty of strong jobs and wage growth with some potentially bumpy roads ahead. So a lot of challenges, but a lot of opportunity. I'm really interested, and Heather, maybe we start with you. Really interested to hear what are you hearing from your workers, particularly the hourly and the entry-level workers in your company? And what role do you think your company, Delaware North, can play in trying to support those workers and give them some assurance of economic security as they're working their day job?
Absolutely, Dane. Thank you. And you know, that proverbial question of what keeps you up at night, I think this is it, right? How do you have the constant balance? So a couple of things, I think, to maybe think about the latter part of your question first. What's the role of a company in terms of looking at this? And particularly for us, we are primarily 90% frontline workers, day in, day out. And a couple of things that come to mind. One, open and honest communication has never been more of a requirement. So for us, we are certainly trying to make sure that we're doing that in every which way and touch point. Number two, I think, is safety and security. I think particularly in the roles that our associates and team members have, they're in the front lines. They're in the travel industry. They're at the airports. They're in the sports stadiums. They're in the resorts and lodges, right? So when you think about that, we want to make sure that they're also feeling safe and secure. So I think with those two things, it allows us to understand and meet associates where they are. So much has changed. People's lives have changed. Compensation has to be at the forefront, but as we know, it's kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You've got to be able to get the baseline right. And I think the old way of you did a once a year review in terms of where market competitive things were, that's ramped up in terms of we're doing that on a much more frequent basis. So let's make sure the baseline on comp is there. And then we're making sure those other things I talked about, the communications, the recognition, and the safety and security are active in place. And when we talk to associates, if that baseline of comp is there, that recognition piece goes so much farther. And when I say recognition, it's when you're walking into a stadium, it's that, hey, how are you? And recognizing them for who they are as the individual and not the job they're performing that day. And I think that to us is kind of the big bubble that we're trying to work through. I'll pause there, but.
That's really helpful. I want to pivot over to you, Franz, because Heather talked a little bit about pay as one of those elements. And talk to me a little bit about PayPal's efforts. Same question, but there's pay, but how big of an issue is pay And then what are the other factors that are important to your workers as well?
Yeah. So we've spent a bunch of time as a company whose mission is to improve the financial health of our customers and communities and to democratize financial services so that everyone can afford to have access to the global economy. We've also looked inward really hard to make sure that we are building the financial health of our employees. And several years ago, we took a very disciplined look to understand like how our workforce was doing. And we found that a third of our workforce, and we have workers that go from folks in call centers and working in data analytics to people, who are, other versions of frontline workers, whether they're in facilities or managing offices, all the way to engineers and lawyers, et cetera. We found that a third of our employees were struggling financially, in that we paid at market or above market, but that wasn't enough for them to really build financial security and financial resilience and what we define as financial health. And so we developed a formula, and we basically said, our values are such that we need to make sure that our workforce has financial health and can be resilient. And we created a formula to determine how much disposable income our employees needed to have to invest in financial health between meeting all of their expenses, taxes, housing, things like that, and what it took to then invest in having some savings and in being able to create financial resilience for the description you have right now of the current economy. And what we found is that pay was only one part of the formula. We invested in making sure that every employee had stock in the company. And so from every single employee that didn't have stock, and it was a considerable number, we gave grants of stock so that they could invest and grow with the company. And we added to that merit-based stock to follow. We changed the cost of healthcare, especially in the US. Healthcare was a really regressive tax, that your healthcare cost similarly to the person who might be working at reception or working in maintenance. And it was really a big burden on people. So we changed the cost of healthcare for our employees by as much as 50-60%. And that was tangible and big for them. And then we also adjusted wages where we felt that wages were out of sync. And we added a financial education program. And we have found that has really improved the financial health and resilience of our employees at every level of the company. And we can come back and talk about that more. I don't want to go too long on it, but it has made a big difference for our being able to sort of stick with our employees as they navigate different times in the economy, because they've been able to build some resilience. And we've seen real changes in 401k participation, in how many of our employees have the full healthcare benefits, how many are able to start saving. So it's made a real difference as we come into tough economic times, and particularly during and post-pandemic.
It's interesting. I'm going to go over to Julie here in a second, but part of what I heard you say that you didn't say literally is also your efforts are also building generational wealth, whether it's stocks or other. You're trying to not just provide some economic security to your current employees, but you're providing a model by which those parents and aunts and uncles actually model the type of economic security that they want their children and grandchildren to have. And I think that's an important part of what, whether you explicitly said it or not, is part of what you're trying to accomplish as well. With that, let me go over to Julie. What are you hearing from the employees at Bain, and what do you think the role companies should play in providing economic security to their workers?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Dane. And I'll also speak a little bit more what we're seeing in the clients, given the sort of focus on frontline here. We have definitely some of those in our business function teams. I want to amplify what I think Heather and Franz shared about the importance of a family sustaining wage, like a wage that really can enable a family of four to be able to meet their needs and grow over time. Benefits are also mentioned by Franz, super important to ensure that there's ways you can show support of employees by wraparound services and benefits and access, things like backup childcare, things like different parental leave policies, et cetera, that I think can create additional security during life challenging moments. I wanted to maybe add two other things, and I think, Franz, you touched on it lightly, but this idea of upskilling, reskilling, and enabling to have employees feel like they're important to the business and that we're going to invest in them as an asset as opposed to some sort of a disposable, widget to just be worked. And so the recognition that some jobs are going to change over time and there's going to be, automation or cuts in certain areas or changes in a challenge of the business. So treating workers with the opportunity for reskilling, upskilling opportunities, access to other roles in the organization. I've seen some of our clients, and we've been working on this ourselves, create a more robust talent marketplace in the organization, because there might be a certain part of the company that's experiencing some contraction, but there are other parts where those employees might want opportunities and might have access to roles that can help them grow, that can help them build their own security and add to their own skill set. So what are the opportunities you provide to help your employee grow in their skills, get access to education, whether it's internal or external, and that can be through benefits or through talent marketplaces. And the last thing I'll just mention is that all of this, back to the beginning of your question, was what are we hearing from those hourly and frontline workers? And so I wanted to underscore the importance of good listening mechanisms. Companies need to have feedback loops in place so you can keep your finger on the pulse of various cohorts of your employees and understand how varying events outside your four walls and inside can impact an employee's psyche, their ability to contribute to the full capabilities that they have, what's on their minds. And then you can course correct and learn some things by having a consistent dialogue through those sorts of feedback mechanisms. So I think it's more important than ever for companies to have robust ways to engage and listen to their employees.
Yeah, I'm trying to resist the temptation for a follow-up, but I'm not going to be successful because I really want to pick up on this point. There's listening and then there's doing. So I want to hear from you. Maybe and maybe Wanda, you can talk about this as well. So after you listen, how does Bain & Company actually communicate the translation of what you've heard to action?
Yeah, and you're right. We could go on for a long time, and I'm sure Wanda has plenty to add here, so I will keep my comments short and she can go further. But it's a great prompt, Dane, because again, it's not just to have an employee engagement survey, check the box, we've quote listened, but nothing happens. It goes into a black box and no one knows what happened. We take a lot of effort into both collecting feedback, cutting it by various groups, whether it's local geographic units, whether it's our affinity groups or our employee resource groups, and then playing back through some leaders in that local group to say, here's the themes that we've heard. Here are some of the gaps of the experience that we're hearing from one part of the organization to another. And so here are some of the ideas. We had some write-in comments, or we got a little bit more than just a score, but actually some suggestions that we've been thinking about. But then we want to convene, whether you call it a focus group or just a listening session where you can get a few representatives together of that function, of that location, of that population to provide more information and color commentary to what we might have collected, and then jointly come up with what are some ideas that we could trial, that we could work on together. And so I think it's both important to not only establish that you have listened, come up with some interpretations and ideas, and then engage in deeper dialogue to jointly collaborate on what you might do differently to try and improve the situation. But Wanda, I'll hand it to you to see what else you might add.
Thanks. And hi, Dane. Great to see you. And yeah, I agree with everything that Julie said, right? It's about listening, but then it's about making sure that you fully understand and appreciate what your employees are saying and that you're taking the appropriate action. Because listening without action just becomes performative, right? And people see through that pretty rapidly. So, for us, we're listening in multiple ways throughout the year, whether it's weekly sentiment surveys, whether it's annual employee surveys, whether it's focus groups, or sometimes it's just conversations in safe environments where we're giving our employees the opportunity to share their voice, their perspective, to tell us what's working and to tell us what's not. But then it's really taking all of those things and figuring out what is the action that we should take on it. I can probably give some examples of how that's happened, right? So when if you think about the last 2.5 years or so, and where this environment of diversity, equity, and inclusion has shifted significantly with the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 to women and people of color. And then, of course, the murder of George Floyd, which really brought social justice to the forefront of our thinking. We did listening tours around our organization, actually globally, because everyone was interested. And based on that, we heard ideas from employees that we implemented pretty rapidly. So we heard employees say, you know, we want more training around how to be allies, or we would like to have a deeper understanding of the various experiences of different populations throughout the country. We also heard employees outside the US say, you know what, we believe in DE&I, and while we have a global strategy, still feels a little bit too US centric sometimes. So how do we take that and make it real for us outside of the US? And, you know, one great example at Johnson & Johnson and how that has worked is an example where we actually created a strategy around Blacks in Brazil, where we're looking end to end in what we do to support the Black population and our Black employees in Brazil. So those are some of the ways that it really comes to life. But I really think it's important to not only listen, but to really make sure that we're understanding what are the key insights, and then most importantly, to take action that's meaningful to the employee and actually drives change.
So Dave, maybe could I add one other aspect? I think this is that's exactly right. To be able to listen and respond and to build that trust and credibility with employees is so critical. We tried something interesting in addition to the surveys. After we had introduced our financial wellness program for employees, we created a sort of a cohort independently chosen and had a research team undertake over 18 months of financial diaries project. So for 18 months, we did qualitative interviews every week with a representative cohort to really understand how our programs were affecting them week over week for close to 2 years. And it really provided an entirely different ability for us to sort of understand cultural change, what was happening, you know, within teams, in communities and families, and to be able to see which parts of our program were really having an effect on people's financial health and on their sense of security, and where we had unanticipated consequences or what the experience was. And it was really an interesting complement to those pulse surveys or focus groups, even the safe space discussions we were having. And I just throw it out there as another interesting aspect of how to understand the employee experience over time in a more nuanced way.
That's really helpful, Franz.
And
so we've talked a little bit.
Can I just add one thing to that? Because I think that it's important that as we're listening, it's also important to make sure that we're understanding the different employee groups and the different demographics, because what we find when we listen is that different groups may be experiencing your organization or development or their perception of career opportunities differently. So it's also important that we break that down by the various cohorts of employees that we have, the demographics of our employees, so that we make sure that we truly understand that and can put, again, meaningful solutions in place, right? Like if we think about flexible work arrangements, we know that women have different needs than men do when it comes to flexible work arrangements. So how do we make sure that we put the right solutions in place for all of our women employees around the world? So I just think that's an important caveat that we need to pay attention to.
I think this is a really important point. It's almost as if, you know, we're shifting a bit away from here's the policy and it applies equally to everyone, regardless of what your needs are, regardless of what you and your family's needs are. I'm not suggesting we're going to have a menu of 50 options for individuals to choose from, but I think flexibility is the key, both in the policy and at the practice level. And so I think that's, I think where many of our members have come a very long way as the nature of work has changed, as we've looked at the inequities in our society, in our workplaces. And I think that's what's so encouraging about the practices that we see in corporate America, but also the discussion we're having here today. Let me, we've talked a little bit about the economic context, and we've blended some of the equity issues in as well. Most of you are leading DE&I efforts, some of you hiring within your companies at a time when there's a lot of tension on the inequities that are experienced in the labor market. And we've got a very tight labor market today. But there are also barriers to skill attainment. And there are barriers to job placement, career advancement that disproportionately hinder women and workers of color. And maybe we start, we haven't heard a little while, we'll come back to you, Heather, to chime in here. But from where you sit, why do you think these barriers have persisted for so long? And where do you see the most promise for business to address them? And this question would not be complete for me if I didn't say, or didn't ask, what are the data points that are helpful in making the business case? We can do what we think works well, but if it's not informed by data, all for naught. So Julie, over to you. Excuse me, not Julie, Heather.
Right, okay.
That's all right. Go ahead, Julie. I can fill in right after. Go for it.
All right, whatever way you want to do it, that's totally fine. Look, I think it's really important to recognize that when we think about just raw talent and innate capability, we know it's distributed equally across the human race, as every biologic study shows us that. The challenge is there are significant barriers and inequities in terms of access to resources and access to opportunity. We know about the racial wealth gap, the gender wealth gap in this country and in other countries. You can look at the disparate outcomes that exist in every system in our society: judicial system, financial system, healthcare system, educational system. So there are barriers that are clear and inequitable outcomes that are happening. And these barriers create real problems of access, as I just mentioned, to resources and opportunity. They're compounded by the fact that when a business or any organization starts out more homogenous in terms of the workers, patterns of success and accomplishment are developed in those groups which are consistent with their ways of working, their past experiences, which makes it even harder for those individuals. They might overcome the access barriers, but then do they have the readiness to truly excel in that environment where they've had little exposure to those ways of working or those types of techniques or ways of speaking, et cetera. So we know that there's a lot of barriers. And at the same time, there is data, there are study after study that talks about you get better business outcomes with more diverse people at the table. You get more creativity, you get more innovation, you get less groupthink and more ability to bring together points of view and lived experience from demographics and different skill sets. And so that we know will get us better answers to the toughest problems that we're all trying to solve. So there is a conundrum here to say, if you know you need that diversity in order to be able to be successful, yet there's a bunch of barriers, I think what you have to do is be resolute in trying to think about, well, how do we try and construct a more equitable talent journey and also a more inclusive work environment where this diverse talent can succeed. So as we think about it, businesses just have to be deliberate about every step in the cycle: how you build your pipeline, how you recruit, how you onboard, what you're offering in pay and benefits, as we've been talking about, but then further learning and development, advancement, promotion, and other recognitions. And at every step, there are discrete and proven practices that can advance equity. And there are metrics that can be utilized to measure the gaps that you have and to try and have more deliberate focus. We've been working very closely with an organization called Grads of Life. It's part of the Year Up organization. And we've co-authored a study last year on 10 proven actions to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm going to talk about a couple. You can find that study on Bain's website or on Grads of Life's. But I think what's been challenging has been a lack of some data and some concrete actions that companies can try and measure and see success with. So on talent acquisition, there's a way to really debias your job descriptions, take out gendered language, take out areas of focus that are more likely to appeal to one gender or one person of different backgrounds than others. You can focus more on skills and on credentials. And we'll talk, you mentioned that in your opening, Dane. I'm going to go deeper into that later, I think. But this idea of saying being outcome focused, what are the skills we need? It doesn't matter the credential. That's a shortcut, and it's laziness sometimes, as opposed to trying to find folks that have the capabilities that are truly needed. One of the things we've been trying to do at Bain, for example, is have more tailored internship opportunities designed to access folks earlier in their educational journeys of different backgrounds to experience what consulting is all about before they've gotten too deep into their studies so they can be more aware. So for folks that are Black or Latinx heritage, we have created just specific programs to increase access, knowledge, and opportunity for those groups that may not have been as familiar with consulting before they started at their various universities or programs. I wanted to just mention a couple of other things around coaching as well, because I talked about upskilling before and deepening that sense of connectivity to your employer. And what we recognize is that folks join companies and they need some additional support, perhaps, to feel a true sense of belonging and to feel that connectivity with their coworkers. So investing in affinity groups, investing in explicit mentoring and sponsorship programs where you're really targeting ways to help newer employees of just different backgrounds feel a sense of commitment from their colleagues and also an ability to navigate the organization from day one are things that we've been using at Bain and we've seen many of our clients use as well. Last point I'll make, and then I'll hand it over to you, Heather, is just saying beyond systems and processes, we do know that leadership mindsets and leadership behaviors matter a lot. The day-to-day way we interact, and do we create an inclusive work environment where folks of different backgrounds can truly feel like they not only belong, but they're valued, they're asked to share their points of view, and that they are treated fairly and with respect. And so we have really thought a lot about how do you as an individual leader show up in such a way to increase that level of inclusion. And as Wanda said, well, different levers matter for different subpopulations. So it's not exactly one size fits all, but a deepening sense of curiosity, an ability to ask questions and learn as a leader, and creating space for your teams or functional groups to get together and spend more time connecting are all things that we know can increase that sense of inclusion for folks of very different backgrounds.
Okay, maybe I shouldn't have gone after you because I think you absolutely covered everything. No, Julie, thank you. I think it, and Dane, this is such a wide-reaching topic and conversation, and the question in its own right could be an entire afternoon. I'll kind of pick up on a few things that Julie talked about and what you referenced. One, data. Data is important, and I think, but the piece with data is it's really easy to get incredibly overwhelmed with the amount and vastness of data. So I think for organizations out there, and certainly what we've done is pick one or two of those, right? Pick one or two to say, this is where we're going to make and start the impact, because the piece to this is not going to, it didn't happen overnight and it's not going to get fixed overnight. And so I think for organizations, find the data points that are important to you when you talk about the business case. Hopefully we're well beyond, and organizations understand fundamentally the more diverse thoughts, opinions, and folks around the table make business better. And so with that, you have to figure out who you are from a culture standpoint. Two, I think the other piece is that it's okay to say we're going to have some honest conversations. And if I leave this and somebody didn't feel awkward, we may not have gone far enough. And that strikes the balance in terms of the types of leaders that are willing to have these conversations today. That shifted, and EQ and emotional intelligence and feeling okay to say, I'm a leader, but I don't have to have all the answers, I think is critical to paving the way forward. And I think, you know, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about the headlines of the Great Resignation and what employees are choosing in terms of the organizations they want to be affiliated with. This is a core element. So just as we were talking about, you can have the information, but then what are you doing with it? You're going to have to start somewhere, and it's not going to be perfect, and be willing to have the conversation. So I joined the organization about 18 months ago, and about 6 months in, there were conversations, we're going to restart our business resource groups or BRGs. And I said, well, help me understand, how did they work? How were they working? What was impactful about them? And we ended up taking 2 steps back before we just put in something that was just in place, because we really wanted to make sure we understood, A, while our global headquarters are sitting in Western New York, our larger constituencies are sitting in the rest of the United States, as well as in United Kingdom and Australia and New Zealand. So we really wanted to make sure we're having a global, holistic, and sustainable approach to this. So, and totally agree, Julie, there's, you know, we've got to move away from this cut and paste of what we've always done. And there's going to have to be intention, and there's going to have to be forcing on, do I really need to have the undergraduate degree there? Are there skills that I have there? And there are things that automatically, as AI, as fantastic as it is, unintentionally are cutting out some folks in terms of actually bringing them forward in terms of great candidates for our candidate pool. So a couple of nuggets just to reinforce from our perspective in a different way.
Great. You all are teeing this up really well for me for the segues that we're having. And you mentioned job quality, and maybe I'll go to you, Wanda. I read one of my rags, I call them, this afternoon, and there's the Aspen Institute of Economic Opportunity that came out with something yesterday, and it listed 3 characteristics of a good job. 1, economic stability. 2, economic mobility. 3, equity, respect, and voice. We've talked about some of those things this afternoon. We've all heard about the Great Resignation. Nearly 3% of the total American workforce has resigned. And that's as of August. And over 1/3 of those resignations were in the accommodation and food industries or the retail services. But the data tell us that many of the quits are job to job. Transitions. Workers quit one job because they found a better opportunity. You may not be in the retail trade industry, Wanda, and maybe Franz, you can chime in here too, but really interested to hear what are you doing to recruit, and more importantly, what are you doing to retain the workers? What's keeping them there? Because it's not just the $2 more an hour for the entry-level workers. I mean, I have to believe it has something to do with culture and some of the other issues, let's call them benefits that you talked about earlier. But Wanda?
Yeah, thank you, Dane. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right. When we think about our talent, our employees, our workforce, we need to think about the totality of them as people, right? So, and we've been talking about some of this throughout this panel this morning, but it's not only security in their job, but it's looking at financial wellness and health wellness and mental health wellness and all of those kinds of things that are really important to employees. So at Johnson & Johnson, in order to help us really define that better, we really take a data-based and evidence-based approach to that. And for diversity, equity, and inclusion, we use that evidence and that data to build a strategy that we believe aligns with what our employees say that they want, right? And we believe that because we talk to our employees to actually gather the data and to understand the insights. And that leads us down a path of really at J&J focusing on 4 big strategic areas that are important to our employees. Number 1, our employees want to be a part of a workforce where they see themselves, and there's diversity that represents the patients, the communities that we serve. So we're focused on how do we do that better. Another thing that's really important to our employees is that they want to feel like they belong. And when we went and we gathered this evidence from our employees and we looked externally, we talked with more than 7,000 employees around the world in 33 different countries in 6 different languages. And while we found that diversity, of course, looks different wherever you are in the world, the feeling of wanting to belong and wanting to feel included and wanting to have a voice was exactly the same no matter where you were, right? Didn't matter what country, what language, employees all wanted to feel the same. And so we believe that we really have to continue to strengthen our culture of inclusion. And we've already heard a little bit on the panel today that actually starts at the top, right? So there has to be the right tone at the top. There has to be intentionality around that. And you have to have the right systems, processes, and extremely importantly, accountability in place to drive that within your organization. And so we have a real focus on creating and strengthening our culture of belonging at J&J. And then we also have ways of measuring that so that we can hold our leaders accountable. So we have something that we call an inclusion index, where every leader with more than 10 employees gets a score of how their team feels they are at being inclusive. And then we provide those leaders with tools and resources to continue getting better at being an inclusive leader. So that's another important thing. I also find that in this world where, in this time where people are really focused on sort of social justice, employees want to see our organizations lean into that in meaningful ways. So at Johnson & Johnson, one of the ways that we've really leaned into that heavily is through an initiative that we launched in 2020 called Our Race to Health Equity. and it's using the big of Johnson & Johnson for good to try to mitigate health inequities for people of color in the United States. And that has really energized and engaged our employees around our organization in a very meaningful way for them to not only feel that J&J is making a difference, and we are making a difference, but for them to personally get involved to be able to drive that difference forward. So those are some of the things that I think are really important to employees when they decide to stay. You know, they want to have an organization that aligns with who they are and their mission in life. And, you know, at Johnson & Johnson, we certainly hear from our employees that they value being a part of a mission-driven organization, and they want an organization that purposefully is aligning with what they think is important in the world. So I think all of those are really critical things to keep in mind.
Great. Thanks, Wanda. Franz, before you jump in to my panelists, we have about 20 minutes left. This is good. The remainder of our time together is going to be a little bit like speed dating. And so I'm going to ask for not pithy responses, but punchy, succinct responses. And Franz, I want to pick up on the question that I asked that Wanda answered. Dan's your CEO. It comes from the top. What's PayPal doing to attract and retain workers? And how do you know it's working?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'd love to pick up on what Wanda was saying about being clear about your mission, clear about your values, being very, I think, open about what you stand for within your company community, and helping employees feel a connection between the work they do and the mission of the company. And that can come in a number of different ways. It can come in the way that you build products and services. It could come in the behaviors around inclusion and belonging that are demonstrated in the workplace. And also we found that creating opportunities for employees to engage in the community. We have community impact teams in all of our major offices where we will support employee grant giving, employee volunteering. Close to 70% of our employees around the world last year volunteered, and virtually all in very mission-focused volunteering opportunities. So we try to create volunteering opportunities that represent a furtherance of the mission of the company. So in this case, it could be economic empowerment. It could be closing the racial wealth gap. It could be inclusive economic recovery, climate resilience and adaptation in vulnerable communities. And we found that one of the most powerful ways to build culture, but also to create a connection to the mission, is this kind of engagement of employees in the furtherance of the mission, hands-on engagement, and also helping to draw those connections between the work you do day to day and what the company is seeking to achieve in its mission. And I think our CEO, you know, when you said, well, what does Dan do from the top? He really sets the tone, sets the mission, and speaks to the values, and really works hard to draw that connection between the day-to-day work we do and the mission we're fulfilling.
Thanks, Franz. I'm going to resist the temptation this time so I can follow my own advice and shift over to Julie. We're going to get a little bit into the remainder of the time, some of the specific efforts you have underway. And Julie, earlier you referenced some of the work Bain and companies involved in around skills-based hiring and advancement practices. This is tough. I mean, we are trying to change an entire HR ecosystem that has been grounded in credentials. That's how you get in, that's how you advance. Bain and Company is a founding member of the 110 Coalition, which I'll leave you to talk about, which is an example of bringing together employers and community organizations to build a more diverse and equitable workforce. You're a part of the BRT's Multiple Pathways initiative as well. But you're also doing a lot of work in career-connected insights and engagement with a lot of different organizations across the country. Talk a little bit about what you've learned from those engagements and what are the results you've seen as a result of those engagements?
Yeah, absolutely, Dane. Thanks. And I will try and stay concise, and I can always go deeper as folks like. So 110, just so folks are aware, it's a coalition right now of over 60 Fortune 500 companies that are committed collectively to hire 1 million Black Americans over the next 10 years into family-sustaining wage jobs that do not require a 4-year degree. And all these organizations have put forth unbelievable efforts, leadership, programming, and sharing of best practices to help each other make sure that as a collective we achieve that goal. And that's a really big commitment to skills-based hiring, as we were talking about. And I think that that's really important because there's high demand for skills. Employers have significant unfilled job openings because they can't find the talent they need with very explicit types of skills. Some people are unable to find the jobs that really have good family-sustaining wages because they may not have access to those skills or talent suppliers that can help them develop them. So we see this disparity in local markets of where the organizations have jobs that can't get them filled, and there are people that are underemployed or looking for ways to grow. And can we create a bit more of a closed system to help that matchmaking happen in a more effective way? And why do we think this is happening? It's mostly because education and employment tend to be misaligned and disconnected. A lot of times employers are waiting around for talent to show up. They act as talent takers and not talent makers. And we really believe that this is the posture that employers need to adopt, to be more of a talent maker, work more proactively with a number of talent suppliers that are different than the traditional 4-year university. It could be community college, it could be certificate granting programs. And so we think this career connected learning, where you can have different community-based organizations working together, the high schools, the postgraduate options of all varieties, certificate granting institutions, and the employers, to have a little bit more of an open marketplace on what's needed, how to develop it, and how to have individuals get the investment they need so they can have growth in their trajectory as an employee. And the last thing I'll just mention quickly is that I think there's a lot of things to learn about the importance of community-based organizations working side by side with employers, right? There needs to be a direct linkage between the supply side and the demand side, if you will, and it's gonna have to happen through the community-based organizations, inclusive of the schools, with the employers working more together, because that creates clearer pipelines where people understand how to access different opportunities, and it has the opportunity to go beyond a pipeline to a pathway where we can have articulate, clear, understandable pathways for folks to enter, grow, and thrive as they join different organizations. And as we reflect together about the companies and the community organizations, they can constantly evaluate if the partnership's working and course correct together. They just bring complementary skills. And we've been really proud to try and be an enabler and a facilitator of a number of these types of partnerships.
Thanks, Julie. I'm going to go to Wanda, but just really want to quickly mention on the BRT's website, we have, through our corporate initiative, the Multiple Pathways, we released a number of playbooks a couple of weeks ago. One was around what a metrics framework looks like. How do you evaluate the success of this work? We did that with Grads of Life that Julie mentioned. We have another one around internal mobility. And each of these playbooks around those two issues, talent acquisition, innovative models, there are a lot of company examples, profiles that go deep into what these companies have done and what they've learned. So I would encourage you to take a look at the BRT website as well. Wanda, I'm really struck by Johnson & Johnson's public commitment to the ESG framework that includes women in 50% of management positions globally and 50% growth in the number of Black employees in US management roles by 2025. Why did the company set these aspirations from a business perspective? And what are the steps you've taken to actually realize these aspirations?
Yeah, Dane. So yeah, we actually have 3 goals that are publicly available, and 2 are the women in management level positions and above at parity by 2025. And I'm pleased to say that we just had our year 1 where we're reporting that out, and we're already at 48% in 2 of the regions in the world. Our EMEA region, our Latin America region are already at parity. So we are well on our way to achieving that. And we're also on track for our Blacks in management and above positions with 24.6% growth in year 1. And our 3rd goal is around having 35% of our manager level position in the US being ethnically or racially diverse. And we're at 33.9% there. So we're really well on track there. And how we're doing that is we're being intentional, as we've all been talking about throughout this panel. And so there are very specific things that we have. Number one, we have great accountability systems that are embedded throughout the organization. So every people leader has a goal in their performance and their development annual goals around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we're tracking that. But along with that, we're also making sure that we are putting the right systems in place to develop talent in different ways. So one of our signature programs is called our Enterprise Sponsorship Program. And in this program, we are very intentional about sponsoring women and people of color, women globally and people of color in the United States. And we've just had phenomenal results from that program. In fact, we have more than 1,000 sponsees in that program, and we have 93% retention. And in the 2-year period that people are in the sort of official programmatic stage, we have about 48% promotions that come out of that group. And then it continues after that. So significant results there. We also have differentiated development programs. One is called RISE for people of color in the US. And the other is called, I'm blanking on the name of it, but there's one for women as well. I just cannot come up with the acronym of it right now. But we have those kinds of programs that really focus in on the specific needs that women and people of color may have, and connects them with leadership and sponsorship to make sure that they can achieve all of the career goals that they have. And those programs have also been extremely successful. But I think, again, it's about being intentional. It's about being transparent. It's about driving accountability throughout your organization. And then, as we started earlier in this panel, it's about listening to the needs of our employees and making sure that we're putting in those differentiated development opportunities to help them accelerate their growth and achieve their career goals.
Thanks, Wanda. I'm convinced we're going to get Heather and Franz in here to close out this session. And Heather,
Okay.
I want to turn to you on talent growth. So we hear a lot about the jobs that your company offers in food service, retail, hospitality, and sports. And a lot of these jobs are often characterized by what I don't like to say, low skill, but they require fast decision-making and teamwork, a lot of attention to detail, emotional intelligence. And how does your company think about the growth and talent development for the employees in these roles? And what are the investments you're making in those employees? And if we can get to the point quickly, Franz will have a chance to close us out.
I got you. I'll be succinct, Dane. And I couldn't agree more. The concept of low skills, we frankly look at those as, I think, and how you described, whether it's teamwork, attention to detail, emotional intelligence, those to me, frankly, are life skills. And so these opportunities are vast. Sorry, my light's going out there, but to me, so what we try and do is there's a practical element. There's a lot of hands-on, right? We understand you might be, you're in weather situations, et cetera, but the life skills that you're learning on that really create the foundation. So we've got a progressive development program for individuals that really is building that internal talent pipeline. We're being much more intentional, I think, a little bit more to what Wanda was talking about, and making sure that we're differentiating those across the different segments. As we start to dissect our data, we're seeing where we've got the gaps and the opportunities that we need to dive in a little bit better, understand why we have them and what we need to be doing differently. But frankly, I look at them as life skills, and we've got some great opportunities by which to propel folks forward with those.
Hey, thanks, Heather. Okay, Franz, I want to ask last question to you on economic security. So as I understand it, PayPal observed that many of your hourly and entry-level workers were really struggling, paycheck to paycheck. But your company's been involved in a number of efforts to increase the financial health of its workforce. I think you've talked a little bit about this earlier, but there's one initiative in particular, the Worker Financial Wellness Initiative, that aims to make workers financial security and health a C-suite and investor priority.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that, and what have you learned from that?
Yeah, so I think what you're referring to is a partnership we entered into shortly after we introduced our employee financial wellness initiative within PayPal. We partnered with Just Capital to create a public initiative called the Worker Financial Wellness Initiative that includes partnering with the Financial Health Network, long experts led by Jennifer Tescher in financial health, and the Good Jobs Institute. And we've been bringing together companies who are interested in sharing data, thinking, who are surveying their workers for financial wellness. And so far we have Chobani involved, Prudential involved, Chipotle, Synchrony, Verizon, and companies are joining to basically try to build best practices about what they can do within their companies to build financial wellness. I'm excited. We have a case study coming out from that MIT has put together on this work. So it's an exciting initiative, mainly because we're building a sort of community of practice around this notion that companies, there's lots of things we can't control in the world, but we can control how we take care of our workforce. And that's a great place to start. And imagine if the employers and global employers with millions of employees could really invest in the financial wellness and health and security of their employees, what an impact that has on families, on the next generation, on communities. So this is a very promising initiative, and it's growing as more and more companies get involved. Some companies get involved to share a program, some get involved to share data, and some to sort of join in the learning.
This is a real test. We have 3 minutes left.
We can't hear you.
One action step that you think a company should take. Wanda?
Be intentional and drive accountability.
Julie? You're on mute.
Yep. Keep listening and make sure you really customize for different populations and try it, test and learn, test and learn, test and learn.
Heather?
Use data and then start to do something.
And Franz?
Financial wellness and financial security is part of a holistic approach to wellness overall. So keep it in that bucket.
I've learned every time I do one of these sessions or have conversations like this, I learn so much. A couple of things I've learned though is, and not just because corporate America are my members, but I am so encouraged that companies are walking the talk. They understand the importance of taking action. Yes, listening is important, but taking action is more important. And taking action and evaluating whether those actions were in response to the problems or the challenges that were identified by the employees. Secondly, and it's a point that Franz made, employers are all facing similar challenges. And I think particularly for some of the members that I work with, they're understanding, recognizing, and valuing the importance of working together. Our influence, our ability to have impact is even greater when we do this work together. We can get to scale much more quickly, not just within our company, but across the United States in addressing some of the equity issues that we've been talking about. And lastly, evaluate what you're doing. It's the point that Heather made. We won't know, we can't live by stories and anecdotes. We have to live by the data and make changes based on that data. And I think that's where we ultimately change the systems that many of you are talking about changing within your own companies. So please join me in thanking our panelists today. And the next time we get together, maybe it'll be around the fireplace at Wanda's house. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thane, thanks so much for that conversation. I really enjoyed that, and thank you to the panelists. It was certainly a very thought-provoking discussion, and I really enjoyed in particular, the solutions that were provided. And speaking of solutions, and before we move on to our next panel, we want to engage you. So you've heard from a number of the corporate executives about what companies can do or what they're doing in their companies. So we're eager to hear from you about your ideas. So now's the time for you to participate. So we'd love for you to respond to a question that we put in the chat now. And that is, what do you think, what are your ideas around potential solutions to improve economic mobility for low-wage workers and others who've been excluded from opportunity? So please share your thoughts in the chat on promising policies or programs or innovative solutions that you think would make a difference. So we look forward to gathering that information. So, but now I want to pivot to our research and practice panel, where we'll dig deeper into what the evidence says on what employer practices and policies hold and how they hold promise for unlocking economic opportunity and advancement for low-wage workers. So it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this panel, and that's Sissy Lamb. Sissy is a learning evaluation officer at the Conrad and Hilton Foundation, and she supports the Opportunity Youth Initiative, which is focused on removing systematic barriers so young people can build careers and achieve economic success. In her role here, Sissy works with the grant-making team to develop measurement frameworks, execute research grants, and build learning practices for the foundation. So Sissy, over to you.
Thanks so much, Todd. Thanks so much for the introduction. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Research to Action panel. We want to continue the theme of both innovative and proven practices within the workplace so that can support access to mobility and opportunity for workers. We're going to dive a little bit more into what the research says about what employers are doing and what more they could be doing to support upward mobility for low-wage and frontline workers. We're also going to explore the role of public policy and the government in setting standards and providing guidance to employers on what constitutes a quality job. And a note to our audience, we would love you to join the conversation. So please feel free to enter in your questions in the Q&A box. We're going to have a little bit of time at the end to address some of those questions. So joining me are a distinguished panel of researchers and practitioners. And I think everybody turned their cameras on. Great. So first we have Kristen Hartnett. She's a professor of social and behavioral sciences at University of San Francisco. She and colleague Danny Schneider are also WorkRise grantees. We have Erin L. Kelly. She is the Sloan Distinguished Professor of Work and Organization Studies at the Sloan School of Management and co-director of the Institute for Work and Employment Research at MIT. She's also the co-author of a literature review on employer practices published by WorkRise. Next, we have Kimberly Shin. She is managing director at FSG Talent Rewire. And finally, we have Shane Spalding. She is a senior fellow in the Income and Benefits Policy Center at the Urban Institute, whose research focuses on evaluating workforce development and post-secondary education programs. So welcome, everyone. So let's kick off with some questions for the whole panel. So good jobs and job quality are terms that are increasingly finding their way into debates and discourse about the kinds of jobs we want all workers to have. Both the Department of Labor and Commerce have joined forces to create a set of good jobs principles. They're designed to provide a roadmap to advance job quality for all workers. So I'd like to ask each of you, what do you consider to be the most important feature of job quality, particularly for the mobility of disadvantaged workers? What are the incentives driving employer practices in this area today? I want to start with Erin and then go through the rest of the speakers.
Great, thanks for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. Sissy, I'm not going to be compliant. I'm not going to answer your question directly, but I'll say it's hard to identify the most important feature of job quality because the challenges differ across jobs. But I would like to say, I think the most important message about job quality for employers and others interested in making progress on these issues is that there's room for change, that there are modest and moderately scoped changes that can support workers' economic well-being and quality of life without harming the organization's performance or bottom line. Now, sometimes that turns into clear benefits for firms, but I think it's safer to say we can get to do no harm for firms quite often. And so our team in our recent review wanted to offer a way of thinking about job quality and economic mobility. And so instead of getting to one aspect, I'm going to lay this out just very briefly. So there's 3 ways that we see job quality may affect mobility. So first, we can just raise the quality of jobs for current workers. So that direct strategy is improving wages and benefits, clarifying promotion pathways. Second, employers can make jobs, better paying jobs, more accessible to applicants who are currently crowded out or facing disadvantages in the labor market. And of course, that orients us to thinking about recruitment and hiring and taking a hard look at the stated requirements of jobs. And then third, we can talk about the sustainability channel. What happens where we have workers in decent paying jobs, but the way work is organized, maybe the schedules, maybe a hostile culture for people of color, means people are getting pushed out routinely. And so that leads me to the incentives. I think we all know the tight labor market is really ramping up our attention to this. And tight labor markets and difficulty recruiting workers, part of what they do is help employers recognize the costs of the current practices. You know, that offering the low jobs and the lack of paid leave and the poor schedules and the limited voice and the lack of respect, those always hurt businesses, but we see it now. We're seeing it and feeling it more directly than we have in the past. So that's why I think the incentives are turned up right now.
Shane?
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me today. So, there's been a lot of work on job quality issues and lots of frameworks that have been put out there. And I think this is all really exciting. And you'll see some common themes across those frameworks. And of course, like the level of pay is something that's really important to people. But actually, when you ask workers, and if you look at surveys of workers, other things that are very important are stability. Stability is, something that workers really value. And so it's not just stability generally, but like the being predictability of pay. That's such a high value for workers. I think the other thing that you might see missing from some job quality frameworks is, and this is just on a very individual level, but and this the last panel kind of alluded to this. Workers want jobs that are meaningful to them and what give them a sense of purpose. And this relates to mobility because, I think sort of being aligned and in a job that sort of aligns with your goals and interests is really important. So I will say that this is not as much about what employers can do, but as we think about the talent pipeline and how workers get to those good jobs, thinking about the kinds of information they have on those pathways, on the quality of the jobs, on finding those jobs that are aligned with their interests and skills, I think are really important. My work has focused on workforce development. So of course, I think there's a value in employer and provided training or training provided in partnership with education and training institutions. And that kind of effort and focus can really support worker mobility. I think there's also this element of, and maybe we don't talk about this in the training space, but training supervisors and mentors to support workers in being able to advance along career pathways, advance within a workplace or to a better job at with a different employer. So I think all of these are really critical, along with the obvious things around pay and benefits and the work culture, which Erin alluded to.
Absolutely. Kristen?
Thanks so much. I appreciate Shane raising the importance of stability and predictability, and I want to reinforce those points. I co-direct a research study called the Shift Project with Danny Schneider, and our focus is on service sector workers. And we asked those workers, what are the important features in a good job? And at the top of the list is stable and predictable pay. There's a lot of attention to hourly wages, minimum wages, living wages, and those are certainly important policy topics and important for job quality. But the stability and the predictability of pay rises to the top, not just for service sector workers, but also when Gallup surveyed, fielded a national survey, stable and predictable pay was also the most important dimension of job quality nationally to workers. And so I think that really needs to be appreciated. And when we think about employer incentives, certainly when we focus on the service sector, there is a lot of emphasis on minimizing labor costs. But I think I would argue that there is a strong incentive for employers to consider stability and predictability, that there are incentives for that as well. That when workers have more stability and more predictability in their schedules and in their pay, they are more likely to stick around. So stability and predictability reduce employee turnover, which is good for a business's bottom line. And we also see a lot of benefits for workers' well-being. They sleep better, they're less distressed, they're happier. And when we're thinking about workers who are in a customer-facing position, it's not hard to connect the dots and see that some of these practices, there really is something in it for employers to making workers better off, which is going to make workers more productive, and I think will have positive benefits for companies.
Hearing you all say that, it just seems obvious, but I'm glad the research is actually surfacing those things. So lastly, Kimberly, anything you want to add?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, plus one to what everyone said. I think when I was thinking about this question, I thought back to a conversation I had with a group of frontline advisors that we work with. And we asked them, not specifically what job quality measures or practices do you value, but what do you want? What do you envision for the future of work? And the employees responded with the 4 themes. One is growth. So opportunities to acquire new skills, to grow, to learn. The second one is flexibility, to have flexibility in their work, to take care of both their professional needs as well as their family needs. I think scheduling came up with that, to plus one others said. Connection was the third thing. So engaging with coworkers and supervisors in a meaningful way, feeling supported, having a sense of dignity at work. And then the last thing was contribution. And for them, that meant being encouraged to contribute to their communities, but also encouraged to express their opinion and present their ideas, of having that voice. And again, back to that dignity. And so when I think about the incentives for employers to actually be adopting good job practices, I think to what others have said, at this point in today's context, I think employers, how could they not afford to do so, right? There is a cost to not thinking about the stability of your employee base, of your workforce. But I think that's the driving force. I just did a listening tour with employers in our community or our network last month, and all of them cited recruiting for their frontline and retaining their frontline as challenges. And so I think employers understand in this context, like this truly is a new talent world, that they need to be behaving and doing things differently, thinking about their talent differently. But where I feel like this is most successful, employers who are having the most success with this, they're not just driven by the need, the business need, but they're driven also by values. And I think that came up in our previous panel. When you think about all 4 of those companies, that they spoke to how this aligned not just with their business strategy, but with their company values. And I think that's super important, because I think job quality can be performative action. But when job quality is performative action by a company, I don't think it's going to have the impact on the employee that we all want, that it's not going to necessarily lead to powerful and sustained economic mobility. Yeah, and so like at the end of the day, I think my last thought is just job quality. It's not behavioral change for companies, but it's a cultural change, and it requires shifting people's mindsets and culture and belief, which is, I think, really important.
Absolutely. So I want to talk a little bit about employer provided training, and a few of you brought that up already. So employer provided training can take many forms, from the formal to the informal, and this variety makes it really hard to track, leaving us with really limited data on who receives and benefits from these trainings. So speaking of incentives, what influences employers' decisions to invest in firm-provided training, and what might be the consequences for worker mobility? Shane, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure. So I think there are a few issues here that we need to think about. One is I think it's hard to talk about like on the whole. I think we have to distinguish between larger firms and smaller firms, small and medium-sized firms, in terms of how training is provided and what training is provided. And then I think it's also really important to be specific, like who are we talking about? Are we just talking about training for the entry level? Are we talking about at the mid-level? In my conversations with the employers as a part of a project that was focused on the retail sector, which I'm going to talk about in just a bit, a lot of the training was targeted more at the management level. And so really, I think being specific about what kind of training we're talking about, and is it general training or is it very specific to being able to advance in the workplace? The common understanding has been that employers maybe don't want to invest at that entry level because of, especially in high churn, high turnover roles, right? Because people are going to leave. And so you're sort of losing that investment and maybe losing company secrets, not company secrets, but you're losing information that's very specific to that employer, and that worker can take that information elsewhere. I mean, obviously this current environment, competitive labor market, right? There is more of an incentive, as others mentioned, to really invest in training for workers. And I think, at larger firms, you see perhaps more investment. There are more opportunities for advancement within a larger firm, right? And so there might be less risk of investing in those entry-level workers. But at the same time, you see large companies right now really acknowledging, like, I'm going to provide training for my workers, and they might leave and go somewhere else, and that's okay. And so, like, just really seeing that as a value in terms of support of workers. And then for small and medium-sized businesses, I really think there's a role for the public system and for training providers, like to really partner with the public workforce system to provide the kinds of training supports that maybe small and medium-sized employers might not be able to provide directly. And we see this a lot in industry and sector partnerships, right? They're focused on specific sets of occupations. And there's a lot of evidence around the effectiveness of those kinds of approaches to supporting workers' economic security and advancement. And so continuing to figure out how to support sort of those linkages and partnerships between the public workforce system, training providers, different kinds of training providers, right? Not just higher education, and employers, I think is really important when thinking about supporting advancement for these workers.
Yeah, all great points. Kristen?
Thanks. So I'm going to draw on what I know about service sector workers, and I want to focus on advancement opportunities in particular. And when we ask workers employed in retail, food service, hospitality, about the importance of career advancement opportunities, 3 in 4 workers say that these advancement opportunities are really important for job quality. But when we ask these workers, do you have advancement opportunities? Only 1 in 3 of these workers say that they see a pathway at their current employer for advancing and being mobile. And so I think that's a pretty stark contrast. The importance on the one hand of this path, this mobility, these opportunities, and then the lack at many employers for many workers. But this varies a great deal across companies. And I think that can be instructive. And so one company that stands out among food service employers is In-N-Out Burger. For In-N-Out Burger, 3 in 4 of their workers report that they think it's likely they will be able to advance at In-N-Out Burger. And it is probably then no coincidence that these are some of the most satisfied and most loyal workers among food service workers. In-N-Out workers are much more likely to say, I am very satisfied with my job, and they're much more likely to intend to stay at that job. And if we look more broadly in our data and compare across a lot of retail and food service and hospitality firms, we see this connection is really strong between having advancement opportunities on the one hand and being satisfied with your job and intending to stay there. So I think this connection is an important one to keep in mind.
Yeah, Kimberly?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of research that, to Kristen's point, points out the connection between providing advancement opportunities, mobility pathways for workers, and increasing retention and satisfaction. And I guess what I'll offer is an example of an employer that we worked with who saw this linkage as well. And this is a large food manufacturer. The majority of the front line are immigrants. And so on a factory floor, there are I think scores of languages literally spoken. And they observed that the language and cultural barriers were impacting job performance, just impacting communications, how people were communicating with each other on the floor. And it was also having an impact on how these employers were engaging in the community, that being able to access resources within the community was difficult due to the language barrier. And so this employer partnered with an adult education provider to launch a workplace education pilot. And they provided English language learning, high school equivalents, U.S. citizenship, financial literacy courses. And they found that those who enrolled in those classes were actually retaining at a higher rate. And they calculated what was the actual ROI, because there was actually, they invested in this program, but what was the return that they were seeing in increasing retention? And they saw that it was 123% ROI. So, I mean, I think, Aaron, you were talking about some of these practices, they don't cost anything. It's just cost neutral. This was actually cost positive. This had a real return for them. And this led them to then to scale the program to think about, okay, how do we then add on more courses that lead to advancement within the company, particularly for hard to fill roles. And then the cool thing, I think, that this also then kind of led to was thinking about what are the support systems that we need to put in place for our employees to enable employees to access this learning. Because they were finding that there were employees who were interested in coming to these courses, but when they couldn't get there, they had transportation issues and they had childcare issues, which is also true for just on-the-job work. So now this employer is thinking, okay, how can we provide transportation services and childcare services to support our employees? So I love how this actually started kind of a little bit with a stability mobility, went further into mobility, and then went back into stability. What are all the supports that they need to help their employees thrive? And so I think that's an example of how this plays out with an employer.
I mean, what a great example of all the linkages you were mentioning. You were all mentioning before, right? It's I think the ROI, like most people think of just kind of profit for the company, but the ROI, the cost, right? It's also return, right? It could also be translated to return. Aaron, would you like to add anything?
Sure. And I'll just say, Kimberly, that reminded me of an interview with a fulfillment center worker as part of my current study, where we were hearing about how unpredictable schedules were, meaning that he had enrolled in a class that he saw, a community college class that was clearly going to be helpful for his goals to move up within this company in the logistics industry, but his schedule meant he faced the choice of either missing the exam or calling out that day, and so that he would be sure to get to the exam, and then facing some attendance consequences. So it is all interconnected. I'll just say this isn't directly my area, but I was pleased to hear Shane's summary because it matches with my sense of the research. And the only thing I'll add is that my colleague Paul Osterman's recent survey of training did also find some important disparities in who has access to training. And in particular, Hispanic workers were significantly less likely than the general population or than white workers specifically to have received formal training or informal training through their employer. And also we saw these gaps, of course, based on high school degree or less. So I've learned from this conversation, and we can move on in interest of time. Thanks.
Okay, well, this question is for Shane. I think you already mentioned this a little bit, but so your work recently focused on strategies retail businesses are using to help their frontline workers advance. So my question for you is, who are these frontline workers, and what should employers know about the specific barriers to opportunity that their workers are up against?
Yeah, great. And it seems like we're all doing some work on the sort of retail frontline workers, and so others will have stuff to add here as well. So we engaged in some work that looked at both analyzing the characteristics of the retail workforce using publicly available data, and some of my colleagues led that. And then we also conducted a series of interviews with large employers around their practices with respect to frontline workers. Well, of course, we conducted this research and it ended up being March 2020. And it was kind of amazing that employers were still able to speak with us, frankly, during this extremely challenging time for them and for all of us. But, you know, in terms of who workers are, I think in our minds, sometimes we think retail workers, oh, they're all young people, but that's really not the case. And so in our data, we found that about 20% of workers were early in their careers, 19 to 24, but you had really an equal number that were 55 to 75. And so you have workers of all ages that are engaged in retail work. So many people start out in their careers in retail, right? I mean, probably on this call, somebody, at least a few of us, had a retail job at some point. And so you think about that, and just like what an opportunity it is actually to think about what are some of the foundational skills you learn if you are doing retail work early on. What are some of the foundational skills that you learn and can be built upon in your career, whether customer service or dealing with difficult situations, or all of those kinds of things that we used to call soft skills that can be learned through that retail work. And so it's just really to think about the size of the retail industry and how many people have that experience, and what an impact, you know, if we can improve retail work, what an impact it can have on workers more generally. So, and just back to your question about who, you know, who frontline retail workers are, sometimes we think, oh, maybe they're just mostly part-time. Well, 2/3 of this is from data from 2015, so there could be updates to this information, but 2/3 work full-time. A quarter have a certificate or a degree. I mean, to the point about like who gets to advance from Paul Osterman's work, I really enjoyed reading that study, but the sort of who gets those advancement opportunities often are people that already have some education and credentials. So that's important to think about in terms of how do you expand access. And then 1 in 10 have children under the age of 5, so they're managing complex schedules. And if you don't have a predictable schedule, that can be extremely difficult. And 2 in 5 work non-standard hours. So all of those things coming together just, you know, sort of paint the picture of why it's important to provide supports. But then in terms of training, and I think, Kristen, you might have said this when we spoke with employers, one of the things they shared is people weren't aware that there were even opportunities for advancement in the retail sector. And there are, based on the data, we see that there is data showing that people do advance either within retail or outside of retail. And people were not aware. And so they were working to create clear pathways, clear information about what the opportunities were available. And then also training supervisors and mentors and the other kinds of people that really can support advancement. We can all think about our own advancement, and what matters so often is whether you are in both a place that has a culture of advancement, but also whether you have a supervisor who's supporting that advancement. So many were thinking about ways to train supervisors in supporting the career development of their workers. And then I think, you know, we also found a lot were leveraging technology to support training, and that there was just like some, you know, trying to figure out, making sure that people get paid for their time in training. So when they're doing their training on their smartphone or accessing LinkedIn Learning, right? Just making sure that you're not creating an additional barrier to people being able to develop the skills to advance. So those were some of the things we learned. I think the last thing, just the point on data, a lot of the employers we talked to talked about wanting to just really better understand who the frontline workers were so that they can develop talent strategies that were aligned with that group of workers.
Kristen, so we often talk about the importance of wages and earnings when we discuss opportunity for workers, but your work has focused on different but equally important resources, so time and mental and physical health. How should we be thinking about scheduling and workers' time in the context of economic mobility and advancement?
I really appreciate this question very much. Wages are obviously important, and this was one of the focuses of the earlier session, was on compensation. And pay is always going to be an important part of the equation, but pay is certainly not the only, nor is it the most important dimension of job quality for many workers. And Shane really beautifully set the stage here on how important it is to know when you're going to be working and when you're not going to be working, how that affects your ability to plan the rest of your life. So if there's one thing that I want to emphasize in today's panel, it is that time matters a great deal, both for job quality, but also for quality of life. So time is money for the more than half of US workers who are paid by the hour. Their paycheck is determined not just by their hourly wage, but by the number of hours, and the regularity of those hours determine the regularity of their paycheck. So time is money, but time is also more than that. Time matters because when you know in advance how much and when you're going to be working, time is health. Time, protected time, allows you to plan meals, to shop for healthy food, to exercise and engage in enriching, de-stressing activities. Time is also mobility. We heard from Erin's story about how not knowing when or how much you're going to work really interferes with your ability to pursue training or credentials or upward mobility paths. And time is also the ability to form and maintain relationships, which are really just this essential ingredient in quality of life, but also are essential for getting by, for coping with challenges and financial and otherwise, and also getting ahead. So I think having the protected time to form and maintain relationships is also another way in which this underappreciated dimension of job quality can really spill over in just a whole host of different ways to either facilitate or impede a person's mobility, living their life, and planning for a future.
So switching gears a little bit, Kimberly and Erin, this question is for you both. In the wake of the National Racial Reckoning in 2020, we've seen major commitments from businesses to fundamentally change the way they recruit, hire, and promote talent in service of creating meaningful opportunity for Black workers. How are employers thinking about the connection between racial equity and economic advancement? Are they thinking about advancing frontline workers as a competitive advantage? And if so, how can their efforts be scaled?
I guess I'll go first. And I think now more than ever, there's awareness and urgency amongst employers that they need to shift the way they're engaging their talent, particularly the frontline talent, the way they're engaging in their community and society more broadly, and to create meaningful outcomes for the millions of frontline workers who are disproportionately people of color and women. I mean, I think that there's both the business imperative and more growing, like increasingly, a moral imperative that companies are seeing. And so, I mean, as a result, we have the 110 Coalition that Dane spoke about. We have I can't remember who else spoke about, like the Business Roundtable Multiple Pathways Initiative, the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance, and there are more efforts and networks and associations, coalitions that are mobilizing around this, which is exciting. And the thing that we continue to hear from employers is that they have the commitment, again, either because of the business or the moral imperative, but they struggle with the how of doing this. Like, how do you actually operationalize this commitment? How do you actually operationalize? So, for example, the elimination of degree requirements. How do you do that? And particularly at scale within their companies. And going back to what I was saying in the beginning, I think adopting equitable talent practices, it's not simply changing behaviors, checking the box. It's really shifting mindsets and addressing bias. I was kind of a little bit surprised that when in the last panel, when it was asked about like why haven't like inclusive practices taken off? Like what are the things that what are one of the barriers? No one mentioned bias, but that's a real thing. And shifting bias within an organization is incredibly complex and challenging. You can have the CEO buy-in and the CEO commitment that is necessary with an organization. You can have HR on board, but you know what? What about the hiring managers, the people who are actually making the hiring decisions, who are across many divisions within a company and across many like levels within a company? Right? How are we shifting their mindset and helping them to understand the why behind this behavior change and getting them bought in? And so I think like whenever I talk about job quality or good jobs, I think it's so important to talk about, it's not just about changing behaviors, policies, and practices, it's about shifting individuals, because a system is made up of individuals and their individual decisions. And I think that's so important to address, particularly when it comes to racial ethnicity.
Thanks, Kimberly. Very, very interesting. And it's also interesting kind of systems thinking, and then what's the role of the individual and what's the role of the policies, and how do we set up the accountability for those individuals? And again, we're at the interlocking systems here. So first I wanted to say, I learned a lot from the previous panel, the one just before us, about how some of these high profile companies are translating their commitments into real organizational change. And I found that frankly inspiring. And I think this is an exciting time. And yet I'm wondering about how broadly implemented or adopted these initiatives are, and what we'll see in the medium to long term. But the good news is, I think more and more employers and decision makers understand the limited effectiveness of diversity training and unconscious bias training as it was rolled out for years and years. And I think more and more people are thinking about, are owning what are our processes of recruiting, making those hiring decisions, evaluating who gets a raise or who gets training, et cetera, and trying to build in the checks so that we can see where are the problems within a given organization, where are the barriers to equitable advancement. And I think another piece of good news is we have some guidance from older research to kind of inform that strategy. So in our WorkRise review, we highlight the importance of formalized hiring procedures, often in conjunction with the oversight of some people who were doing those equity checks and checking on those things. And our review also confirms that identifying numerical goals and targets and it is an important part of this picture. We also know networking and mentoring initiatives are promising for increasing the racial diversity of the management workforce and for reducing hiring bias. That's some new research by David Padula and colleagues. But I want to also mention two things we don't know or we need to learn more. So a lot of the research on DEI initiatives, and some, including some I participated in many, many years ago, has been focused on professional, managerial, or white collar workforces. And we need to learn more about what these initiatives look like across industries and with frontline hourly workers. And then secondly, I think, the previous panel talked about evaluating and data, but it can be overwhelming for people trying to launch a new initiative to also be involved in that. So I think this is where research partnerships with academics and others can help learn more about some of the newer post-2020 initiatives that are just now rolling out. It's an exciting time in summary.
Yeah, lots of possibilities there for sure. So let's pivot now to a little bit to the solutions to help sustain and amplify the positive trends we talked about today, and also talk a little bit about the challenges and how to address them. Erin, one of the issues you discussed in a recent WorkRise supported landscape report is job design, or how the actual work and task makeup of a job can provide workers opportunities to gain new skills, establish connections and networks within a workplace, and greater autonomy and discretion over their work. You and your coworkers say that changes to job design may be a sweet spot. It can boost productivity and an employer's bottom line while creating opportunities for career advancement and upward mobility. Can you tell us a little bit more about how job design could serve the interests of both employers and employees?
Sure. And I think this is an important topic to dig into, but it also can feel pretty abstract. So when we talk about work design approaches, we're talking about complementary practices that help workers build skills, make their full contributions to the company, and stay motivated and engaged. So that might be a team structure, cross-training, upskilling, real participation and worker involvement in problem solving, often offering some job security so that the frontline worker feels like if I give more here, I can trust that I'm still going to be around in a couple of years. And we've talked about these for years as high involvement work systems, or my colleague Zainab Tan calls them good job strategy. A key is that it's a real system. It's a bundle of practices that's reinforcing. And this is where we get to some of what Kimberly was talking about. Like, what's the culture of the organization? Well, if there's upskilling and participation and this, then I believe this is a place that cares about me, for example. And we know that, as you said, Sissy, there's so much evidence on productivity and service quality benefits. So we know this pays off for the firm. It makes sense that it should pay off for workers' mobility. If there's higher productivity, that should be shared in the form of higher wages, but we need to see whether it is. If there's skill development, that should open up higher paying jobs, but there need to be those paths for advancement that Kristen talked about for that to really be followed through. So I think that this is promising, and, it's important to think about this, as you said, a sweet spot, and trace the longer term implications of it. I also just wanted to mention one more thing. Work design has implications for health and well-being, and this is very much aligned with some of what Kristen talked about. So another group of colleagues and I reviewed the research on that work design and well-being link, and used that to put together a toolkit for employers and worker advocates. They were like smallish, concrete changes that we know have been shown, at least in some settings, to improve workers' well-being and mental health. And so I had asked the team to also put that in the chat, linking the mobility and well-being connections. Thanks.
Great. Kimberly, what in your experience are the key components of successful employer engagement in service of creating upward mobility for their workers? How do you change your approach when working with both Fortune 100 companies and small and medium-sized businesses?
So I'm cognizant of time, and I want to make space for others to have time to answer their questions. But so what I'll say is that when we engage with employers around job quality practices, we take a systems change approach. And I won't go into our 6 conditions of systems change, but I think the most meaningful thing, the most transformational thing that we do with employers that really get them to think about their frontline differently is creating proximity. And who we engage with typically within employers are directors of HR, VPs of HR, CSR, and operations. And a lot of times the folks that we're engaging with within companies haven't necessarily had a lot of interactions with their frontline. And so they don't understand, they are not aware, maybe they haven't had like the clear visibility into some of those scheduling challenges that Kristen spoke to, or they've seen maybe the data on it, but they don't quite understand the complexity of it. And so we bring in frontline, current and former frontline employees as advisors to companies to create some of this proximity and understanding, and helping companies again think about their frontline differently. And that we've seen that as a really powerful strategy. In terms of, even the PayPal, Franz spoke to that earlier today, where he said, oh, we realized at some point that a significant portion of their workforce were not experiencing financial stability or security. And so I think when you create proximity, you create visibility, and then that can lead to change. In terms of working between Fortune 100 companies and small and medium-sized business, I think that principle holds true. I think within a small, medium-sized business, you do have more proximity because you're probably, you're smaller. I think what's interesting is we work with both, and we see that with working with a Fortune 100 companies, you get to scale. When you're working with a company that has thousands of frontline employees, when they change a single practice, if they increase wages, it increases wages for thousands of people, which is pretty exciting. But change is a lot harder to accomplish within larger companies due to, I think, maybe bureaucracy, just the number of stakeholders that need to be involved. Whereas with a small, medium-sized businesses, they're more nimble, they can be more innovative. And so I think we bring together both small companies and large companies in these cohort programs that we run, and we see both of them inspire each other in what's possible, which is really exciting.
Great. I just got a 5-minute warning. I was not paying attention to the time. So I think we should jump to audience questions. So one question we have, like, why are wages so often the largest focus of measuring job quality and equity? Should we shift dialogue from wages to compensation, which includes quality of life and wellness measures for workers as well? I think you all spoke a little bit of that. Is there a balance, or how do we actually start changing that conversation? You talked about, kind of culture change within organizations already.
I could say a quick word and say that I think there's a lot of emphasis on wages because wages are very easy to measure and they're available in all the major labor force data sets. Schedules are harder to measure and track, but I do think that we should be paying more attention to schedules and advancement opportunities and the other elements of job quality that we know to be so important. And so one way to do so, I think, is to make sure that these measures are represented in our major data collection efforts. And then I think also employers who are interested in retaining workers and improving conditions can consider partnering with researchers. Like Erin, I know, has a ton of experience in this area, and with support from WorkRise, we've partnered with IKEA, who's trying to give their workers more control over their schedules. So I think that employers can recognize the importance of some of these other dimensions of job quality and take some action to understand and evaluate how making some changes to these practices might improve their business outcomes and their workers' well-being.
I'll just add 2 quick things. I mean, first was that when we had, we know how to count wages, as Kristen said, and not only do we count them in national data sets, but employers know how to do that accounting. And there's a very powerful source of pressure from financial market actors asking about labor costs and how those have shifted over time, right? So we're at a different point in conversations around wages and labor costs. I think some financial market actors recognize everything that we have said and are trying to reorient what questions they ask of employers and organizations in their portfolios and otherwise, but that's a relatively recent shift in my view. So that's something to recognize.
And I'll just add that we don't have very good data on employer investments in training in particular. And there used to be the survey of employer provided training, and it's no longer administered. And Paul Osterman did that really helpful survey most recently. But I think more regular information on some of those dimensions of job quality would be really important. So, wages, not only, they have to be reported, like this information is available. Whereas there are a lot of these sort of more nuanced information on job quality. It's hard, and employers don't necessarily want to share sort of the secrets to how they're supporting their own workers because it affects their competitive advantage. And so I think there's just opportunities to support better access to information so that we can measure some of those dimensions of job quality.
I think we have time for one quick question. I think it's an interesting one. Can any of you speak to research on recent efforts to organize and support gig workers? Additionally, as many older workers return to the workforce, how are their health, compensation, and other insurance needs are being met? Maybe 2 questions. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll just say that, I'm doing some work on, and it's hard to even come up with the name, but for workers that are independent workers or contract workers. And I think they're often left out of these job quality conversations because we're talking about often the behavior of an employer, and many don't have an employer that you can really look to provide those workplace protections and benefits. And so I think there's some really important public policy questions about how do we support those workers. And frankly, people aren't just one thing or the other. Often they're in multiple kinds of arrangements, or they're moving from one arrangement to the other. And so what does that mean in terms of their stability and economic security, which we know can affect advancement over the long term. And so there are lots of efforts, I think, around organizing gig workers, figuring out new ways to provide supports and the better safety net. And it's definitely an area where we want to do more work.
Anyone want to speak to older workers returning to the workforce and how are their kind of health compensation needs are being met?
I can say I appreciated Shane's point earlier that there's many retail service sector workers in the 55 to 75-year-old age range as there are early career workers. And I think that they're often overlooked because of this misconception that service sector workers are all teenagers. We have started to look at older workers in a more concerted way, and we have a recent paper documenting the instability that older workers face and the connections between that and their worsened well-being outcomes. But we're just starting to scratch the surface on the return to work, the pressures to return to the workforce. And earlier during the pandemic, we were focused more on getting pushed out, like early retirements, when workers weren't really financially secure, but they didn't feel safe in their workplaces. And we saw some older workers being pushed out of these types of frontline positions during the pandemic. So this is all to say, I think this is a really important question. It's something that we're going to be focused on. Maybe other panelists have more to say on this.
I'll just say two things quickly. In an older project, my colleague and I found that when workers had more control over their schedules, that predictability and some input into their schedules, that affected when they planned to retire. And that was actually in a white collar workforce. And I assume it would also be true in other contexts. The other thing I'll say is that Lisa Berkman and Beth Truesdale have a new edited volume out on the question of working longer. And as I recall, like one of their main theses, their main arguments is that the job quality in your 30s, 40s, and early 50s really are important for understanding who chooses to work longer, because actually a lot of where we see these exits are not moving the 65-year-olds to stay until 68 or 70, but the early exits in the 50s and early 60s. So these job quality questions are really essential in midlife, and that affects decisions later on.
So interesting, like so many questions, and the hour just flew by. I just want to thank everyone for joining, and also thank you to panelists for sharing their insights and research with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sissy, for facilitating that panel, and thanks to all the experts. I will just use this maybe as a moment to tease the next, what's going to happen at the end of the day. And that last question about older workers, we have the pleasure of having Jean Axius, who is the global senior vice president and global thought leader for AARP, who will close us out. And so perhaps he can answer that question as well. So I'd like to shift now our focus just a little bit to hearing from, workers. So this is an opportunity for us to hear from leaders and students at some of the innovative educational institutions out there that are successfully bridging this gap between underserved communities and employers in high-wage, high-demand industries. Benjamin Franklin Cummings Institute of Technology is a private nonprofit college that serves workers and learners in the greater Boston area. The college, built from a fund set up by founding father, Benjamin Franklin, provides practical industry-informed education to students that are underserved by traditional educational systems. So my colleague, Elizabeth Jacobs, moderated this panel, and it was previously recorded. Elizabeth, I'll hand it over to you.
We're now going to turn to the knowledge and wisdom of workers themselves and those who work closely with them to support their aspirations in both their careers as well as their lives. So we're so fortunate to be joined today by Dr. Aisha Francis, the president of the Benjamin Franklin Cummings Institute of Technology, which is an urban nonprofit college that prepares students and workers for careers in technology and other high-demand fields. The college emphasizes hands-on learning and an industry-informed curriculum. We're also joined today by Mr. Deshaun Brendow, who's both an alumnus of Benjamin Franklin Cummings, as well as a current student in the construction management program. And I'm so delighted to welcome both Dr. Francis and Deshaun to the Zoom.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us. So Dr. Francis, I'd like to start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about Ben Franklin Cummings? So more about your core programs, your student population, and how Ben Franklin Cummings serves students that are not being served by other educational institutions in the area.
It's my pleasure. We are a technical and trade college. And what I love about the programs that we offer are that they are programs that lead to good jobs that pay at least $50,000 a year and are very available in our local area and region. We're a commuter campus. Almost all of our students are from the greater Boston area, so Boston and about a 20-mile radius. We're a minority serving institution, and we offer programming in engineering technologies, engineering, information technologies and computing, and the trades. And the trades are a broad area for us, but it includes HVAC, practical electricity, construction management, and automotive repair. And it's not the ability for us to have people think necessarily that they have to choose between college or working. And what we offer is a way for you to work your way through college so that people who need to have income coming in while they're pursuing work and while they're pursuing education past high school can do that. And so that's what is wonderful about our college. And we also honestly date our history back to Benjamin Franklin, who left an endowment to the city of Boston so that people who were tradespersons could pursue their trade and also build businesses. So we have a wonderful legacy, and we are also focused on future careers.
Thank you. So Deshaun, we want to hear about your story. And I thought we could just start with a little bit of background, starting with where you're currently working. So tell us a little bit about your current job.
So currently, I'm a maintenance man for the Residence Inn by Marriott. I chose that job field because right now I'm in school, and the traditional trade work is kind of limited to the 6 a.m. to 2, 3, 7 a.m. to 3. And that conflicts with my schedule right now for school. As you said, I am back in for construction management. And I wanted to stay in something that was within the trades field. So I chose, the maintenance man. It covers, electrician work, painting, plumbing, it's the works. So I enjoy doing it.
Excellent. So taking a step back, you mentioned that you've completed a program with Benjamin Franklin and Cummings, and you're currently in a program at the same time that you're working. So tell us a little bit about how you landed at Ben Franklin Cummings, how you chose both of your programs of study, and how you ended up pursuing both the career that your first training program was in, as well as the program that you followed up and you're taking part in right now.
So I kind of have a story that's kind of what Ben Franklin Cummings is core message is about, and it's to bring these skills and trades to the youth and the urban youth as well. I grew up, I didn't have any practical knowledge when it came to putting things together, building, tinkering with things. I was never really into that, and growing up, I didn't know, I wanted to be a cop or a firefighter. And I I was working towards that, but then I realized, maybe it's not something that I really enjoyed doing or would really enjoy doing. So I tried the college route, the traditional college route, and that wasn't for me either. So I stumbled upon Ben Franklin, and I saw all the wonderful trades that they offered, and not only the trades, but the actual degree programs that they offered as well. And coming off of the traditional college route, I didn't want to go into a degree program, so I chose to focus on the trade, and I landed on HVAC. And I chose HVAC because one, it was HVAC is also a very broad field. You get a little taste of electrical. You get a little taste of carpentry. Sometimes you have to tinker with stuff and make things fit. And I like the message and the way that Ben Franklin presented itself to me. And I heard the stories from the students and the alumnus that said, I already have a job offer and I didn't even graduate yet, and that's something that was very important to me, because I knew that after, I'm going to have some type of debt, but it's not as much as a traditional college, but, I want to get straight into it. Experience to me is more valuable than anything. It's above all.
Thanks. So Deshaun set us up really nicely for my next question for you, Dr. Francis, which is about the barriers your students are facing when it comes to completing school. And in particular, I think the traditional way of doing college for a lot of people turns out to not be particularly effective for a variety of reasons. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what Ben Franklin Cummings offers to its students that's different from traditional college, as well as what kind of social and financial supports that you're able to offer students, and whether there's supports that you wish you could offer that you aren't currently able to. And that you're looking towards either from your own programming as you grow or from outside institutions that you feel like you really need in order to meet the full set of needs that students are coming to you with.
Well, I will start that. And if there are aspects of the questions that I've forgotten, please remind me. What we're seeing is that the folks that I think we train are really the majority of learners. They I think have been called non-traditional for lots of reasons, but they're the majority of learners. The majority of learners are at this point first generation college students, immigrants, children of immigrants, people of color, folks who might have been not quite clear about what to do after they finished high school or got a diploma. They are people who took some time off after high school. There are folks who went a non-traditional route and received a GED. So, that's honestly the majority of people. And so one of the things that we do is recognize that fact. And it's important to not always talk about non-traditional this and unconventional that, because this really, the way that people get education for the most part, post-secondary, is by working their way through, by going to a local college, sometimes in bits and starts, by starting and stopping and figuring out what they want to do along the way, because we don't have enough exposure to career pathways in high school settings, in middle school settings. So, I think that's one of the things that we do, is really to start where people are and tell them that you don't have to choose between college and something else, that what we offer, the trade education that Deshaun is receiving, is a college education. And that's what's wonderful about it. It's certificate, but it is a college credit bearing certificate. The other thing is that we are set up so that we recognize that folks are going to work and go to school at the same time, yet we put in place supports that make it much more feasible for people to go to school full-time while they are working, so they can finish faster. You're not going to get to those end results, that income that you want, that personal pride and sense of satisfaction for completing further education past high school if you don't finish. And so we have robust student success team that includes a wellness office. It includes tutoring free of charge. It includes, support with special learning needs if that's what folks need, and also assistance with food insecurity if that's a need that folks have, as well as a lot of other one-on-one personalized approaches to helping people to finish what they started. And, that's an important approach for us. We are a smaller community, which I think is helpful for both hands-on learning and for building the trust that is often required for people to feel comfortable saying, hey, here are my challenges. Can you help me out? Can you give us give me and my family, access to any kind of resources or ideas to help me meet this particular need? On the flip side, if people are not forthcoming, we do have very active students of concern. That's a group of the student success team that meets every Friday, and they look at attendance. They look at performance on quizzes and grades, and they also receive feedback from our teaching staff. And if there are any yellow flags, they are looking to get in touch with those students right away so that we catch things, a slide before it becomes someone falling off the cliff.
I really appreciate everything you said, but in particular, I just want to kind of re-highlight, I think, the traditional versus non-traditional, and sometimes we say alternative. And I really appreciate you pointing out that actually there's judgment embedded in those words, and it's not a particularly accurate one. So thank you for that. And the other thing I just want to call out from all of that I think is really valuable is this importance of human relationships, and how seriously it sounds like you all take those as part of where learning comes from and where success comes from. So I want to turn back to Deshaun. I'd love to hear you reflect a little bit about what the last 2 years have been like for you. I know for many of us, they've been pretty nutty. So I'm really curious to hear from you what it's been like navigating the job market, balancing work and your family obligations during the pandemic, and how that compares to where you are now. You've had a lot going on over the last couple of years, and we'd love to hear what you're able to share.
Yeah, so before I started my HVAC program, that was like right when the pandemic, kicked off in the US. And at the time I was working for the city of Boston. I was a lifeguard for their community pools. And so along that way, I actually had the opportunity to work less hours, but for the same pay almost. And I was, working in the community, giving out food to people that needed it during the, the pandemic, and, people that had fallen on, troubling times. In terms of school and work, how they clashed during the pandemic, I feel like the pandemic kind of gave me that opportunity because it didn't focus. I didn't have to focus on, trying to balance work and school so much. A lot of my classes, it was one class for about 4 hours. I want to say 3-4 hours for the HVAC program. So the days that we could get it online were actually very beneficial to me, and it helped balance that out. And I think the school actually took into account for that, and because they have implemented like one day out of the week I do have online classes, so they are taking steps towards making it an inclusive environment for people that have to feed their family or feed themselves, or they need the money to pay for school, whatever it may be.
Awesome. Thank you. So Dr. Francis, we know from research that pathways into the middle class have become quite narrow, and that far fewer folks are able to make their way up from poverty wages into good, stable, middle-income jobs. And these challenges are particularly acute for those who don't already have access to wealth or social networks, and they're doubly hard for people of color. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what needs to fundamentally change in how we approach higher education and workforce development more generally, so that people and communities, especially those facing longstanding structural disadvantages, have access to these kind of jobs where they can really create a life and a career and continue to build their skills in ways that match what they want to get out of life.
Yes, well, there's so many things, but I'll try to keep the list short. I really believe that to the extent possible, we should help people to make the most of the time they're already spending getting educated. So what does that look like? That means credit for prior learning. I think credit for prior learning, credit for work, college credit for work, college credit for prior learning should be much more rigorously applied. We definitely try to give folks credit for as much of their prior experiences as possible. We are very invested in early college. As an institution, our college has delivered early college and dual enrollment programs since 2006. We believe that programs like Gateway to College, which take off-track youth, people who would graduate from high school late, and embeds their high school experience on a college campus so that they are completing high school as they are earning college credit. All of these kinds of experiences really help people to make the most of the secondary training that they're already getting. And the more secondary education people can have while they're pursuing a high school experience, we know that they tend to then build on that with much more momentum. So I think that these kinds of practices that we know bode well for people of color, for folks who are low income, should have much more investment at the federal, state, and local level. And we should be looking for ways to make it much easier to attend college. Just much easier. And, the more barriers we can remove, the more people who will be able to really follow their passions, to the extent that that includes the need for training past high school. And we know that most jobs today do require that type of training.
So Deshawn, as we think about what's next for you, and I'm sure this is something that you're thinking about, what gives you hope, not only for your own future, but for others who are entering the job market for the first time or re-entering out of a period of being out of work for a while? Are there things that you're hopeful about right now?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak anecdotally, of course, but to the other people, I can't say what gives them hope, but what gives me hope is, just the opportunity I have here at Benjamin Franklin. It's not an opportunity that many get or many even know about or can utilize, even in my own city, and I feel like it is a bit of a shame. But they do give me hope. They're very on it with getting us the resources we need and sending us down the paths that we need to go. And they'll assist you the whole way. And they push me so hard and in a direction that I can actually see. It's not like it's something outlandish. They show me the steps I need to take, and they guide me, and that gives me a lot of hope. And especially with the fact that the job market is recovering a lot from the pandemic, and there's lots of openings, lots of hirings, and here we are talking through Zoom. This it expands the opportunity for work, and just living in this century with technology, it just gives me hope, and it pushes me to do better and always be better.
With talent like you, Deshawn, how can we not help but be infectious and have the optimism that you share with all of us? So thank you for sharing part of your story and for being a great representative of a student at Benjamin Franklin Cummings Institute of Technology. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Francis. I appreciate it.
Likewise. And I want to thank both of you for what's really been a great conversation. I know we could keep on talking for a long while, but I will wrap it up here. It's been such a pleasure having you both here today, and so much gratitude to you both for all that you are doing to make the world a better place.
Thank you so much, Dr. Francis, and thank you to Deshawn. You both really inspire me, and I'm sure others who are participating as part of this conference when we talk about work and what workers want and really hope for the future. That was a powerful conversation. And especially all of the work that's going on at Ben Franklin and other places like that are really focused on creating a more inclusive and resilient economy for young and talented people like Deshawn, who clearly has so much to contribute to his community, and also for employers, whatever employer is going to be lucky enough to have him, and also for the economy. So we're coming close to the end of our day 2 here, and it's my pleasure to introduce our final speaker of the day, and that's Gene Axius. He is the Senior Vice President for Global Thought Leadership at AARP, and one of the conference sponsors, of course. In his role, Gene forges global alliances to foster collaboration on systems change to improve the lives of older workers. We talked about that just a little bit ago. Gene Axius is a passionate champion and catalyst for changing how the world sees and values aging, something we all have to do, I should remind you. He is an internationally recognized thought leader on aging, longevity, equity, health systems, transformation, and modernizing the delivery and financing of long-term care. So Gene, over to you.
Thank you so much, Todd, for that kind introduction. And thank you all for having me to speak with you today. The theme of this year's conference, Charting a Resilient Future for U.S. Workers, Solutions to Navigate an Uncertain Economy, is not only timely, but is also extremely relevant. Today we heard from workers like Deshawn, employers, practitioners, and researchers about reimagining existing approaches and emerging practices to access high-quality jobs and to gain on-the-job experience. The discussions today offered us insights into how employers are not just responding to the calls that they have a role to play, but also some of the solutions and in terms of how they are actually going about reducing some of the inequities that we see, particularly in the workforce, in the workplace, and also in the marketplace. It is fair to say that in these conversations, one group that has often been missed is that of older workers. And I'm actually very excited and glad to hear this topic come up in today's actual conversation. Older workers, particularly in the intersections of age, race, and gender, and many other worker experiences, have often been left out and overlooked in the conversations about workplace and labor market equity. Not only did this pandemic expose long-standing structural issues, both in terms of health and economic inequities, which disproportionately impacted Black and Brown communities, both in terms of their loss of lives and also the livelihood, it also shined a very bright, glaring light on the serious problem of age discrimination that affects workers age 50 plus. According to AARP research that we just released a couple of weeks ago, 2 in 3 adults age 50 and older in the labor market indicated that they have experienced age discrimination solely based off age. Disparities in any form disrupt people's ability to live a longer, healthier, and more productive life. It robs individuals of what they need and rely on to maintain a good health, become financially resilient, live as long as possible, and age as they choose. These disparities also stifle economic growth, and everyone suffers as a result. For example, when older workers are discriminated against, the economy loses. An AARP report that we released last year found that age discrimination actually cost the US economy $850 billion in 2018. And if we do absolutely nothing, this would actually increase to $3.9 trillion by 2050. We know that when it comes to how long you live, where you live actually matters. The environment in which you learn, work, play, eat, worship, and age has tremendous influence on your health and also your longevity. However, there's large and growing gaps in terms of how long people will actually live in the United States. According to our own estimates, we released a report with the Economist Impact earlier this year. We found that the annual economic cost to US GDP caused by racial disparities in life expectancy is expected to reach 1.6 trillion in 2030. Sit with that for a second. 1.6 trillion in 2030. That's in about 8 years. So if we treat every American equally and provide equal access to jobs and healthcare, we can actually grow our economy. Everyone benefits as a result. I firmly believe that we've been given a once-in-a-generation opportunity to address these long-standing inequities that for far too long have cut off opportunities that prevent everyone from having the means to match their life aspirations. And in this new world of work, particularly from some of the insights that we've heard today, we have an opportunity to put the lived experience of workers in the center in our redesign of work and also the workplace. We have an opportunity to revisit how benefits and supports are in service of the engagement of workers of all ages, abilities, and circumstances. We have an opportunity to really think about and to implement opportunities around diversity, equity, and inclusion that really identifies the barriers and then elevate the solutions to greater participation, engagement, and well-being. We are now at a crossroad and we have the chance to rewrite the script of a post-COVID America, a script where the sequel can be much stronger, more resilient, and more inclusive than the first. I firmly believe that this is our chance to innovate, that it is our chance to be bold and courageous, working across sectors and industries to be pioneers in our collective future. Tomorrow, we will hear from leaders in local government and advocacy and their role in creating a more resilient and inclusive workforce. We'll also learn more about how we can turn the risk posed by climate change, technology, and changing demographics into meaningful opportunities for all workers and abilities. We heard a lot of great ideas these last 2 days, and we'll hear more tomorrow. Our goal and our charge moving forward is to take those ideas and to translate those into meaningful action. Please do come back tomorrow and join us. You can access the conference using the same link. Thank you.